Hi, I'm Urmi Desai, editor at MoveSmartly.com, and this is the Move Smartly Show. Today's episode is our regular consumer Q&A, which we call The Situation, where my co-host John Pasalis of Realosophy Realty here in Toronto responds to all your buying, selling, and renting questions about your moves throughout the Toronto area real estate market. You can email John to ask your own questions for future inclusion in a future episode at askjohn@movesmartly.com. As usual, we are going to change the names and edit some of these questions for clarity. If you have a question that was more detailed and require more information from John, you can also email him as a follow-up. So this week, you'll notice that both John and I have raspy voices as we're battling through, recovering from Toronto's first real bout with winter in ages over the past week. So please excuse, the lesser quality of our voices and the occasional cough this week. And now, on to our episode. Hi, John. Ready to jump in?
Ready to go.
Mailbag is full this week.
Lots of questions. Looking forward to chatting about them. But
Mhm.
before we dive in, I actually thought I'd kind of go on a tangent because I think I saw a funny comment in last month's episode, um, which I don't always respond to, but I thought it was funny. And I think someone came on and said, why doesn't you just show up with some data and have a concrete answer rather than, there's usually like two or three different scenarios I'm suggesting. And I thought it was a funny comment because, I mean, anyone who listens to the show, a lot of times these questions are challenging. There's not always a right or wrong question. You can't just plug in some numbers in a spreadsheet and it's going to tell you where to buy and what to buy and what's to do. So, obviously when I have a concrete answer to a very specific question, we can, but a lot of times they're very personal. It involves someone maybe losing a little bit of money on a sale today to move to where they want to go, and deciding which strategy is the best is not about numbers all the time. Although obviously the numbers matter, but obviously there's a huge human elements to that. So anyhow, I thought that was funny. So we'll see what this week's questions or this month's questions look like, but we'll do our best to give some clarity on people's different real estate situations this month.
Well, I appreciate that the desire to have a concrete answer is always out there. I know all of us would love it. But of course, the market, and especially now, it's very slow. There's changing conditions. Still waiting on a lot of economic news. It's fair to say that even some of the numbers that you threw out one week may not be as accurate. Like,
Hmm.
next week. We're talking about, generalities. But also the situation is such that there could be several different moves depending on what you'd like to sacrifice or pay a
Yep.
premium for, as you
Hmm.
were saying, right?
Exactly.
So one thing I do appreciate in your answers is the way you ask us what are the right questions to ask
Hmm.
and where to look to get the right information. Because
Hmm.
I think, as we're going to see, even with this week's questions, sometimes we're not always even asking the right questions.
Yeah, 100%.
All right. So that's my little defense of you, John.
All right.
All right. Hi, John. I'll start with this first question. Hi, John. Thank you for putting out great content week after week and for sharing consumer questions and your take on them. It's a wonderful show you all have going. My husband and I have a primary residence that we bought in July 2022, which is up for a mortgage renewal this year. We have a large mortgage for this home, and since it's further away from the city, we have a commute to work. Along with it, I have an investment two-bedroom condo in Toronto, which is tenanted and gets a bit of positive monthly cash flow of roughly 400 a month. The condo is up for mortgage renewal in January 2026, and I can see costs going up with the renewal. So the question is, does it make sense to sell the primary residence and rent for a bit in the city? Is it wiser to sell the investment condo and contribute any equity towards our principal residence and then sell it? Any thoughts or questions would be appreciated. Have a great week, Mira.
Interesting. So I mean, it sounds clearly, again, we don't have all the details, but it sounds like they are living in an area that's not quite ideal and wants to move closer to the city, to a different neighborhood. So, I mean, a couple things. I mean, number one, I mean, I would not sell the condo, and use that money to pay down the principal residence and then sell the principal residence, in part because it's tenanted and it's generally pretty hard to sell a tenanted property. unless you really need to, you don't really you'd have to negotiate with the tenant, try to get them to potentially move out or agree to move out. So I don't know if I would be planning to sell that until the tenant moves out or until you need to sell it, right? Would be my first suggestion. And it sounds like they just want to move closer to the city anyways. So the condo question is it feels like irrelevant in the context of their broader plan, especially if they're contemplating renting. You don't really need that capital, right? So certainly in their situation, it sounds like selling their principal residence wherever they are that's out of the city is the probably the smart move. When you do it, obviously, is a personal decision. Um, and then renting in the short term, sure, that's fine. Again, I think decision to rent or buy, is a personal one. It sounds like they prefer to rent, which I don't think is a bad decision if you don't know neighborhoods, if you want to kind of be cautious, especially in this market where a lot of the comments we hear from people are people trying to navigate buying and selling in a very volatile and uncertain market. And it's not challenging just because the market's slow, right? Like that we've had before. We can kind of it's challenging because there's so much uncertainty economically. Like you don't know, like literally with the next day, something can happen that's significant that can shift the sentiment, right? So this is something that a lot of buyers and sellers are having a hard time navigating. And certainly for certain people, for a lot of people, usually it's better to sell their current home first, right? But again, if you're doing that, you're typically rushing to buy right after that. And if you don't buy, you can move into a short-term rental. But one way to kind of short circuit that whole thing and not feel like you're rushed to buy is just say, I'm going to sell my home. I'm just going to rent. Maybe it's a year, maybe it's 2 years, or whatever it is. So it's not a bad strategy. I mean, it's kind of a very defensive strategy. They're renting, they have their capital. Maybe in that time they sell their condo, they have a little bit more equity, and they can buy the next home that they want longer term. And to be honest with you, it's probably the better approach. Do you know what I mean? Like you sell your principal residence, you have your capital, you rent for a little bit, and maybe at that point, selling your condo is part of your long-term strategy of buying the home you want in the neighborhood you need, right? And if your tenant doesn't vacate within a year or whatever your timeline is of you wanting to buy your next home, okay, well, then you have to start the negotiations with your tenant to try to work with them about selling a tenanted property, maybe having them move out, and all of those things. So, I think that is the approach that makes the most sense to me, given their, again, specific circumstances.
Interesting. It is interesting that often doing that rent move in between doesn't feel as safe. But it's interesting how a lot of people in the Toronto real estate market do find themselves renting for a period. I just wonder if you could speak a little bit to that and why sometimes it feels like to us a riskier move to not go from house to house, like ownership to ownership,
Yes,
but why in some cases that's defensive in a market like Toronto's.
it's a good question. I mean, listen, I think Torontonians don't. There's a couple reasons why Torontonians don't like doing that and aren't used to doing that. Okay. The first is just convenience. We want the convenience of moving from our current long-term home to our next long-term home. We don't want to have to do two moves. It's a bit of a pain if you have kids. It's not ideal. Most people just want to move into their ideal home, right? Is the first one. So part of it, and we're used to being able to do that. And that's normally what people do. The other reason why people don't like it is that we've become accustomed to learning that prices in the Toronto area increase rapidly. So if you sit on the sidelines for a year and a half, that home, well, that you could have bought for $1 million is now 1.1 or a million 1.5, whatever it is, right? So the prices were appreciating faster than people's ability to save and faster than their incomes were growing, which meant every year that they sat on the sidelines, they were able to afford less home basically. And this is generally one of the main reasons why I think people in the Toronto area were so reluctant to do that. Now, in this market, obviously, we're in a softer market. Prices are not rising. And again, I think this behavior about which one to do is very generational. Like when I speak to people my parents' age, people who lived through the 80s, and you talk about them downsizing and selling their home or buying a home and then selling their home. It's not even an option. It's not even an option to buy first because in their mind is like, well, what happens if the market tanks right after I purchase, the home? Then the home I need to sell is going to be worth a lot less. And they actually feel a lot more comfortable selling, going to a rental, taking their time, not feeling pressured. And again, I think part of that is generational. They've seen markets turn on a dime. I think we have as well, but they've been short-lived. We haven't lived through long downturns. So I think those are the reasons why people are reluctant to do it. But again, in this case, it doesn't look like prices are going to skyrocket anytime soon. I think that risk is relatively minimal that you're going to get priced out of the market if you rent for a year or two. One thing I'd say though in their situation is you got to think about how long you want to be in your rental, and if it's in a home, do you want to sign a 2-year lease or a 1-year lease? There's always the risk that you might get, again, that landlord might want to kick you out and sell the unit or the house that you're living in. So, maybe you sign a longer term lease if that's kind of what your plan is to buckle down there for a couple of years so that you don't have to get kicked out after the first 12 months.
All right. Well, lots of considerations there. I think you just proved your point, John. It's not always about the data. All right, let's go on to the next question. Hi, John. I have an older two-bedroom condo in the GTA, around 35 years old. We are currently renting it out to a couple of university students. Because it is quite old, I'm concerned that the management fee will continue to increase to cover the costs related to repairs. I have been battling between the possibility of selling it in this downturn environment and keeping it for a longer term as a rental unit. How long will a condo building last before it is so old that it would require major renovation and repair work? Many thanks in advance for the help. Andre.
That's a good question. So every condominium has something called a reserve fund study. And it is basically a report that's prepared that shows all of the projected capital expenses that the building is going to need to put money towards. New roof, new windows, whatever it is, major kind of bigger repairs. And this is basically like a savings account. So your reserve fund is your savings account. Your reserve fund study is like a 30-year, I can't remember how many years, but it's something like 25 or 30-year schedule of all of the projected revenue you're contributing to your reserve fund and your projected expenses towards all of these capital projects, right? And so you'll see right now, if you look at your reserve fund study and it says 2025, your condo should have $3 million saved and you only have 1 million, well, you're going to need to contribute more to it. Yes, your building has underinvested into these future repairs. But if it says you should have 3 million and you have 3 or 3.5, then you're in good shape. So I think you just want to look at your condo buildings budget and and your reserve fund, and that's going to tell you generally all you need to know about how well managed it is and if it has all of the money it needs to basically handle longer term investments and expenditures, I should say.
So here you're advising getting a little bit more information. So, that
Yeah.
would give a lot of context to what Andre might want to do.
And you can get that from your property manager. Your board had like if you just asked for a copy of the reserve fund study and it showed you what the plan is and how much your condo has in their current reserve account.
Well, there you go. A change of question. So it's not
There
so
you
much
go.
how long will this building last? It's what does our reserve fund look like? All right, next. Let's move on to question 3. Hi, John. Hope you're doing well. I wanted to give your take on whether it makes sense for me to trade up to a larger condo unit in my building in Liberty Village in downtown Toronto. I currently own a one-bedroom condo, about 562 square foot unit with parking, which I bought for 675K in 2022. My mortgage and line of credit net out to about 585K, which seems to be around its current market value, according to recent sales in the building. So a price drop there. I'd ideally like a larger unit that's approximately 600 to 700 square feet, a one plus den or a one bedroom plus den as it's called, and plan to stay in it for 5 to 10 years. A larger two-bedroom condo is out of my budget. Given the cost of buying and selling, do you think it's worthwhile to make the move now, or would it be better to hold off? Are there advantages to upsizing at this stage? Would love to hear your thoughts. Best, Jack.
So I think we've been getting a few questions like this. And, it's a difficult one because obviously, someone who's bought kind of 2 years ago during a time when prices were higher and wants to move is an environment where prices are lower today. So what do you do? I mean, I'm going to tell you what I would do, which is not necessarily what people would do, because again, my reaction is based on this old school loss aversion mindset. And I mean, I'll tell you the problems with my mindset after, but my instinct would, okay, because it's not perfect. It's not perfect. It is biased and colored with my own,
Preferences.
tendencies. Huh?
Your own preferences. And this is why
100%.
data doesn't tell the whole story. Another reason, right?
Exactly.
It also
So
depends on your emotional preferences.
So if I was in that situation, there is zero chance I would move because in my mind, my unit's down 90 grand, right? Then I got about another 50 grand in transaction costs to upsize, right? So I'm out like 140 grand in 2 years, right? So, and again, your loss is realized, of course, the second you sell your property. I mean, you've lost money at that point, right? So there's two reasons why I wouldn't do it. Number one is mentally, I'd have a hard time losing 140 grand in 2 years. Number two, I would struggle with the idea, is really an extra 100 square feet A worth it? You know what I mean? And B, is that really enough space for the next 5 to 10 years? I don't know. That's for this person to answer because it's still not it's 650 square feet or whatever that little bit extra is. So my instinct is I probably wouldn't. Now, and I'll tell you the flaws with my mindset. Number one, the loss has already happened, that $90,000 loss, right? So at the end of the day, if this person moves up to another unit, right, they're still kind of invested in the market, which means, if I'm in my one bedroom and I'm waiting for prices to appreciate so I don't have as big of a loss, I mean, well, it's not really that different than if this person upsized to a one plus den because they're also going to get a similar rate of appreciation. So do you understand what I mean? So it doesn't
Mhm.
matter if I'm sitting in my one bedroom condo or my one plus den. If prices go up, I'm still going to get that benefit, right? So it doesn't matter that I lost on the one bed because I will have made potentially a little bit of a gain longer term in the one plus den, if that makes sense. So where my money is kind of invested doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, you're still going to incur this $50,000, say, in transaction costs between buying and selling, maybe 60, who knows, depending on the unit you want. So the question is that much money worth it for an extra 100 square feet? Like, do you want to pay 100,000 or 50 plus 6,000 in transaction costs to get a slightly larger unit? And I don't know. That's a personal question. I don't, again, so if you break it down, it's really the big difference is the transaction cost. And I think that's why I was saying the error in my thinking, because if you're invested in a one plus den or a one bedroom, it's kind of doesn't make a huge difference. At the end of the day, if the market dips in the future, you're still invested, you're still going to see a loss. And if prices go up, you're still going to get that gain regardless of which unit you're in, right? I mean, my instinct is just to kind of wrap up is, I mean, I don't know. I feel like that's a small difference you know, to take on a 50, $60,000 transaction costs I get, right? And I never forget, I was speaking with a friend of mine. I don't know if I mentioned this story a while ago. It was kind of funny because he was contemplating upsizing as well, right? And, for him, he was in a detached home in the West End. So for him, upsizing, it's not like an extra 50 grand, it's an extra like 400. Like to go to that next step up is an extra 400 grand, right? And I asked him one day, so because we've been discussing it, I'm like, so what did you decide to do? And he's like, I thought about it. And he's like, I realized for an extra 400 grand, I'm getting basically an extra 150 square feet per floor, a main floor powder room, and a living room where I can look at my television like this instead of this way. And I realized it's not really worth 400 grand, right? And it's kind of a funny way. And I think it was very relevant to think about it because not everybody thinks about it that way, right? And in his mind, is
Well,
like,
yeah. I mean, first, the irritation of having to see the TV the wrong way
yes,
and the one bathroom being missing is just so grand. And I think it's very important to take a step back and put a price tag on
yeah,
your discomfort, which is kind of what you're suggesting here, right?
exactly.
If
Yeah.
the price tag of that discomfort, it's the 1 + 10, that might be a work at home situation. You're trying to maybe make a little bit of a space. I'm not sure what that den is being sought after for,
Hmm.
but that is something to consider, and whether there's other ways to deal with that situation if that's what it is. But
Yeah.
I sympathize because the irritation's real, but
Yes.
forgetting to put the price tag on it is the problem.
Yeah. 100%.
Trying to solve something, a pain point. And sometimes with something as big as real estate, you don't do the math
Yeah.
properly to see how much you're paying.
So in this, yeah, and going back to this person's example, I said the real cost is like the 50 grand and the transaction cost, which it's actually not 100% true because
Mhm.
they got to also spend an extra, say, $75,000 for that larger unit,
And
right?
monthly costs, condo fees usually go up
Are going to
per
go higher.
square foot size, right?
So between the additional cost of the unit, say
Hmm.
let's just say 75 grand plus your transaction cost, that's 125,000. So you're going to be spending about an extra say 600 bucks a month on your mortgage plus slightly more on your maintenance fees. I mean, is it worth it?
Well, that's a
And again,
price.
I think this to your point, putting a dollar amount to what I'm getting and is it worth it for me, I think is critical because if I'm in that situation, you got to do the math and say, am I willing to pay an extra, I don't know, 700, 800 bucks a month for an extra 100 square feet? Because that's kind of what it comes down to, right? And listen, I'm not saying it's not like for some people, my friend's reaction about not spending an extra 100 is crazy because they would want those things. And again, this is where real estate decisions are not about necessarily data and numbers because it's people's personal preferences. Who's willing to make a particular sacrifice one way or the other? Because either way, you're making a sacrifice.
Hmm.
If you upsize, you're making a bit of a financial sacrifice because it's going to cost you more in terms of upfront money, plus your mortgage payment, plus your maintenance fees are higher. But if you don't, you're sacrificing in a smaller space. So you're sacrificing how you live. So again, these are the tensions, and there's no perfect answer. But yeah, these are the things that I think want to be thinking about.
Yeah, it might come down to how many people are fighting over the bathrooms.
Always attention for
Yeah,
sure.
some tensions may be greater than others.
I
Let's
mean,
put it
and
that
listen, people can manage in small spaces. We have past clients of ours who were a family of three living in a 2+ den condo downtown that I think was maybe 900 square feet. And they were just very efficient at it. And I think they eventually moved out when they had their fourth, and they're like, we need a little bit more space.
Wow.
But they were living, family of five in a 2+ bed condo, two adults, three kids, 900 square feet, and they're just very efficient about how they lived and organized their house. So it's possible if you really want to make it work.
Well, at the very least, maybe that mental image makes Jack feel like they're living in a roomier place
100%.
already. That's hard to contemplate. All right. Well, thank you. Let's move on to our next question. Dear John, I enjoy listening to your updates. They're very informative. My husband and I recently purchased a townhouse for one of our family members. We hold a small mortgage and they pay us rent, which covers the cost of maintenance and the mortgage cost. Our family member has decided to move out. Should we sell this, the townhouse, sorry, or rent it out? If we rent it out, is it best to do so through a property management company?
Mhm.
Thank you, Clara.
So again, I think it's a good, I mean, there's two parts to this question. One is just financial planning. I mean, do you want to hold a property long term as an investment, maybe your retirement? I mean, generally, unless you have something else that you really need to use this money for or invest in, I mean, why sell it? Just rent it out. It would be my instinct. Um, Again, I'm used to renting. Some people don't like being landlords, but there's ways to mitigate the risk of being a landlord. I think you just need to be prepared to hold on to it longer term. I've had situations recently, people ask me, should I hold on for another year? Should I hold another two? I mean, this is like the wrong mindset. Like if you're holding it, hold it for the long term. The market's not going to be that different a year from now. So, if you want to do it, just buckle down. Don't worry about what happens in the next year or two and say, this is my 10 to 15 year, retirement investment property or whatever it is. So, certainly, I mean, I think it's like I said, if unless you have something you want to do with that money and invest elsewhere, and I think that's the key thing. I've had clients who are in similar situations who are some of them are just de-leveraged, selling investment properties because they think, you know what, I'm not going to make that great of a return over the next 5 to 7 years. Like they're not very optimistic, right? So they want to sell and put their money in the markets, right? So I think this is where, again, there's no perfect answer. I mean, I'd probably hold it because I like real estate and I'm more familiar with it. But for other people, they might think they might make a little bit more money in the equities markets or something else. So again, personal decision about your retirement plan. Now, if you decide to rent it, should you do it through a property management company? Again, I don't necessarily think so. I think a lot of people sometimes do it if you have multiple properties and they're kind of hard to manage. But if it's just one property, I mean, you got to think about what is the property management company doing. For starters, rentals a lot of the time are done through agents. A lot of property management companies are agents as well, so they just list it for rent on the MLS, you know, rent it out. After that, I mean, what the property management does is obviously depends on what you want them to do, but there aren't usually a lot of things to do. Like there aren't a lot of deficiencies with homes. I mean, it's not like the toilet breaks every week. I think this is people's nightmare, you know what I mean? And they're gonna call me the toilet broken, but it's not that difficult to manage. I mean, there's like apps for everything now. You go on Jiffy, you order a plumber, you tell them to go to the house, and it gets fixed. So managing a property is not particularly hard, I would say. So I don't necessarily think someone needs to outsource that to a property management company. You just need to be a bit organized. You need to have potentially some contacts. And if you don't, like I said, there's a ton of apps that, can help with that process of dealing with repairs and dealing with updates and dealing with maintenance. I don't necessarily think if you have one property, you need to get a property management company.
All right. Again, your mileage may vary. What if you get very stressed out
Get
at
stressed
the
out with
thought of
what?
any
Managing.
toilet breaking?
Listen, and I don't want to discount that because you're right. I've had past clients who like would get anxious like every time the phone would ring and it's the tenant. It's like they don't want to pick it up because they're worried it's going to be something, right? I mean, my instinct is if that's you, then sell the property. You shouldn't be owning real estate, right? Because it doesn't really matter if it's like the property manager who's getting the call, because eventually you're going to get the call from the property manager. You're going to be notified of what goes wrong.
I
Um,
wonder if they have a little more data to work with too, because they had someone in it. So maybe think back to how many times you had to help out,
well,
or
exactly.
your
With
family
your,
member had to do something. If they were taking care of it themselves, maybe get a little bit of information from them.
yeah,
And you might
absolutely.
find out that the major repairs weren't as much as you thought.
Yeah, exactly. And listen, here's the thing. Major repairs you're going to see eventually you have to do anyways. Roof, furnace, all of that stuff is, those are not the things necessarily to worry as much about because those things you schedule, you can do. The things that most landlords worry about is the small things like the fridge breaks or this breaks or, washing machine breaks. Okay, you have an appliance guy, you send them out, you take a look at it. It's not the end of the world.
Now, one final question, in case this is just a misunderstanding on Clara's part. I'm not sure that that's the case, but on the issue of how to find a good tenant, which is a bit different,
Oh yeah.
whether there's a confusion about whether a property management company does that or somebody else does that. Can you
That's
comment on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, property management company. So, generally, whoever's representing the landlords to review tenant applications, whether it's a property manager who's an agent who lists on the MLS or a real estate brokerage, like we review all the applications. Um, and generally, our agents review the prospective tenants' income and credit. And we were looking for like there's so many red flags these days. There's so many fraudulent employment letters. There's so many fraudulent credit reports. I mean, you can just create these on Photoshop. It's not, you don't need to, it doesn't, you don't need rocket science to do this. So you have to be very careful to look up the companies they work for and do some due diligence. And a lot of times it's just there are too many red flags that we just tell our clients it's not worth it. Like go to the next person. And it's unfortunate, but it's so hard if you have a bad tenant to cut them out that you have to be extra cautious these days. And do as much due diligence as possible. And we always recommend sellers also do their own or landlords do their own, but we also, the agent should be doing some and making recommendations based on their own research and analysis, finding the person on LinkedIn. Just there's so many things that you can do to vet their application just to make sure there aren't inconsistencies.
So that's one area where you're suggesting it might be good to spend a little bit on outside help.
Yeah, 100%. And depending on like, especially if it's a home, most of those are rented on the MLS, which is the system that realtors use, right? So even if you are managing it yourself, you're typically going to list it with an agent I mean, you could try listing it yourself on third-party websites, and if it doesn't work, you can list it on the MLS. But it is definitely one place where it's helpful. And the positive thing too, a lot of times is that when there's two agents involved, like usually the tenant's agent, usually but not always, will have also vetted the tenants, right? Because they're not making a lot. Like agents each make like half a month's rent on a lease, right? So the tenant's agents running around, they want to make sure the tenant is a good applicant. So a lot of times they've done some of their own due diligence. Plus we obviously do our own. So you kind of get like a slightly filtered pool of people, I'd say.
All right. Well, thank you. Hopefully that helps, Clara. I think I'm just about due for my next round of lemon honey tea.
We're both recovering. We're both
We just
recovering. We got
we
hit
just
with
made
the
it. Very interesting questions. Thanks to everyone viewing and listening and sending in questions. And again, you can send them into askjohn@movesmartly.com. And we'll look forward to reviewing all your questions again in a month's time on this channel. Thanks, John.
Thank you.